What are the Codex Fuldensis and San Galensis 1395, and what importance do they have for scholars?
What? Am I my PhD exams here? What?
Dr. Bart Ehrman, welcome back to MythVision Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
It is honestly always an honor to have you on here. I love learning from you. You're one of the more enthusiastic academics out there. And I don't know what it is, but when we talk, people are watching. Maybe it's your personality. Maybe you just say it like it is, and it sometimes gets a lot of attention.
I think it's my stunning good looks.
I'll let you have it. I have a fantastic fan of MythVision who really appreciates your work, and he made this episode possible. But I want to give a plug. You've got a Paul and Jesus course coming out. Can you tease our audience with what that is and what they might expect?
Yeah, well, most people think of Christianity as the religion based on the death and resurrection of Jesus, and that's certainly Paul's view. Paul's entire point is that you made right with God by believing that Jesus died for your sins and was raised from the dead. The question is that what Jesus taught? When you look at our earliest sources for Jesus, it appears that he teaches that there's a kingdom of God that is coming soon, that God will destroy the forces of evil and bring in a utopian place for his followers. And that means you want to be one of his followers, which means if you're sinning, you need to repent and turn back to God so that he will forgive your sins. And you can then, you can start living differently. You can live for God, you can live for others, love your neighbors yourself, so that you'll enter the kingdom. And so if that's right, if Jesus is right, that he's teaching love of God, love of neighbor, enter the kingdom, how can Paul be saying the same thing when he says, no, you've got to believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus? Is that the same thing? Or is it completely different? Or is there continuity between them? And so I play this out in a course of 8 lectures, 30 to 40-minute lectures each, where we play out what Jesus was teaching, what Paul was teaching, and then comparing, is this similar, the same, or different?
Bart, I look forward to seeing you there. I'm actually helping put that thing together with you. And I know for a fact that this course is going to be a game changer for anyone who's serious about learning the origins of Christianity, who Paul is, what Paul's teaching, who Jesus was, what Jesus taught. So be sure to sign up. MythVision will be there. I'm going to go ahead and jump into these questions from our fan, an anonymous fan. Scholars from many nations have contributed to the advent of critical biblical scholarship since the discipline began in earnest during the Enlightenment. However, it is safe to say those academics based in Central Europe, especially in German regions, have provided a disproportionate number of scholarly discoveries and advances from the time of Reimarus to the present. Even Gerhard Kittel, who became a notorious supporter of the Nazi regime, co-edited a multi-volume New Testament theological dictionary still in use today. Dale Allison, in his MythVision course, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, devoted 4 of his 8 lectures to German and Swiss luminaries. Do you have any thoughts on why this development occurred? Could it be the Reformation, followed by the religious conflicts culminating in the 30 Years' War, weakened the influence of church control and dogma over scholarship, while enlightened rulers, as epitomized by the flute-playing skeptic Frederick the Great of Prussia, fostered universal education and academic inquiry?
Can I just say yes? It is a very interesting phenomenon that people spend a lot of time thinking about. When I was in graduate school in the 70s and in the early 80s, we always called German the biblical language. Yeah, we had to learn, of course, German and French, but as part of our research. But all the serious scholarship, not all of it, a lot of the really serious scholarship was in German, and so you had to learn German well enough to be able to read the books and the articles. And I would say that it is pretty true that up until probably, into the 20th century, most of the really hardcore stuff was in German. There was some in French, and there was some in English. And so for a long time, it was kind of Germany and German-speaking areas, and England, somewhat France, and then somewhat America. Now it's completely changed, though. I'd say it's completely changed. I would say America really is more at the forefront, and then Germany, and England, and so those three are the kind of the big spots. Even other places in Europe, not so much, France and Italy and stuff. And it's no accident, I think, that those are the three areas that had a very strong Protestant influence. And it does go back to Martin Luther. I mean, once you say that the sole authority for understanding our world and understanding God and understanding salvation, the sole authority is the Bible, not church authority. Once you say that, you better start studying the Bible. And so the influence of Protestantism played the role of significance, but so much so that, I mean, even into the early 20th century, when Albert Schweitzer writes his Quest of the Historical Jesus, which is the German's von Reimarus zu Vrede. So from this figure Reimarus to Vrede, two German scholars, one writing published in 1770s, the other published in 1901. That period, it's like Schweitzer says, like, it's all German, baby. he mentions, a couple of French people, but basically it's German. And he says only Germans could have done it. He says this, only Germans have the mentality to do this. And so that's a large part of it is because of the Protestant Reformation.
Thank you. What is the Pseudo-Clementine literature, specifically the homilies and recognitions, and how important are they to New Testament scholars, Dr. Ehrman?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. To most New Testament scholars, they're not important at all, because my guess is 98% of New Testament scholars have never read them. Probably, I bet the majority could not define them. That's what I would say. I certainly couldn't when I finished my PhD. No way. So, Pseudo-Clementines. So these are the two most important works, the recognitions and the homilies. They are better known now than they were in the early 80s. Scholars have gotten more familiar with them. They're called the Pseudo-Clementines because they are about and allegedly by Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome was one of the early bishops of Rome in tradition, the third or fourth bishop, depending on how you count. He allegedly was converted by the Apostle Peter himself. And the Pseudo-Clementine writings are called Pseudo-Clementines because people now realize he didn't write them, but they claim to be written by him. They are two versions of the same basic story, which is about Clement's conversion and then is accompanying Peter on his missionary journeys. And so they're highly legendary accounts. They are long, and when I was in graduate school, they were registered as one of the most complicated areas of scholarship in early Christianity, because the only thing that people wanted to talk about, this is mainly rooted in German scholarship, was the Ur text behind these two. These are two versions of the same story. And so what scholars were incessantly trying to do, the four scholars in the world who were interested in doing this, what they wanted to do was figure out what the original text was that these two were offshoots of, and then to see what that would be useful for historical purposes. So anyway, that's what they are, the Pseudo-Clementines. They date from the 4th or 5th century. They're forged. But they're very interesting. One reason they might be interesting to some New Testament scholars is because they do appear to present a view of Peter as being far superior to Paul, and Paul being a problem. Not the great apostle that we all have come to know and love, but being a heretic.
That was probably the one part I was hoping you'd mention. Thank you.
Well, there's one Pseudo-Clementine that the person didn't ask about. That's a preface to the homilies. That is allegedly a letter by Peter to James, the head of the church in Jerusalem, where Peter warns James against another figure who is converting Gentiles with a lawless gospel And Peter, allegedly Peter, says, "This man is my enemy." And it's clear as day. He's talking about Paul. So this is a forged letter saying that Paul was Peter's enemy.
Real quick question on that before we move on is, I can't imagine they pulled all this out of the air. When I'm reading the New Testament, I did not even read the homilies, the recognitions. I see some strife. I mean, it clearly spelled out that he confronts Peter, but beyond that, even, it sounds like Paul makes little jabs here and there. So the question I have is, do you think that this, I mean, there is obviously an agenda on the author's behalf to really downplay Paul, probably for other reasons that aren't related to first century, but do you think that they're also pulling this from the New Testament?
To some extent, yeah. I think the conflict between Peter and Paul in the New Testament is not really about what we would think of as the essence of the Christian message, that the death and resurrection of Jesus brings salvation. I think they both completely agreed on that. I think they agreed that Jesus' death was an atonement for sins, and you have to believe in his death and resurrection. Where they disagreed is it's principally in the book of Galatians that we learn about it. And there the disagreement is that Peter and Paul draw different implications from this message. They both agreed that Gentiles and Jews could be followers of Jesus. But Peter was more the persuasion that it meant that Jews could maintain their Jewish identity distinctively from Gentiles, which would affect their behavior within the Christian community, because Jews and Gentiles would have to be somewhat segregated, at least some of the time, for Jews to keep their Jewish identity. And Paul thought that was completely anathema, that in fact Jews and Gentiles were equal in Christ, and there can be no separation of any kind. That was their conflict. The author of the PseudoClementines and the traditions standing behind the author appear to have been more favorable toward the idea of a Jewish Christianity that maintained some kind of Jewish identity. And where keeping the Jewish law mattered. And so he was more on Peter's side of that, and he championed Peter for that reason. And he's getting it, the traditions go back to the New Testament, already to Paul, but I think the tradition lived on even apart from the New Testament.
Thank you, Bart. How have the discovery of the Ugaritic texts impacted scholars' understanding of the evolution of Yahweh from a storm or mountain volcano deity to one acquiring some of the characteristics of surrounding Canaanite gods, including, temporarily, possessing a consort? What is the Kenite, Midianite hypothesis?
Right. That was my real expertise, Ucaritic. This is a very long story that I'm not going to get into because I'm not much of an expert. Ucaritic is a Semitic language that's very similar to Hebrew, and when the Ucaritic texts were discovered well over 100 years ago, at the end of the 19th century, it was recognized that they could be useful in unpacking the Hebrew language, because when you're dealing with Hebrew, the language of Hebrew, it's complicated because the only ancient Hebrew text you've got, biblical Hebrew text you've got, that kind of Hebrew, is found in the Bible. So it's not like the New Testament, which is written in Greek, but is where you've got thousands of Greek texts to look at to see what words mean and to look at where ideas came from, because you got all these thousands of texts. The Hebrew text, that was it for the Bible. So that's the Hebrew that you got to figure out what the words mean. But now you started finding these comparable languages, these cognate languages like Ucaritic. So you can figure out, what the word cucumber meant, or something. So that it was good for that. But it was also, what was stunning about it is that these Ugaritic texts also contain stories comparable to those found in the Hebrew Bible, especially a creation account that sounds very much like, in some ways, using similar words and similar concepts to what you get in the creation account. The Ugaritic findings were part of kind of a larger phenomenon going on at the end of the 19th century, where they found texts where you've got creation stories and flood stories, for example, including Canaanite texts. And in some of these ancient Near Eastern texts, you've got this like chief god who has a female companion. And scholars have thought that Asherah in the Old Testament, who is a goddess that's worshipped in Israel, Baal and Asherah are both worshipped. And so the idea is that they're Asherah is the consort, and some people have thought that that Yahweh was understood within Israelite traditions to have Asherah as a consort, and they find evidence actually in the Hebrew Bible itself. And so the significance of this kind of finding, not just the Ucaritic, but also the Canaanite and Egyptian, ancient Near Eastern stuff, is that it helps put these biblical ideas into context, and it helps you realize, gives you kind of a fuller understanding of what it means. And so in one case, it might mean that there were Israelites who thought that Yahweh was married. So that's a word.
Makes sense. And then I guess the last was just the Midianite Kenite hypothesis. From what I understand, and then you might want to fill in the gaps, is somewhere down in the south of Southeast Asia there, near Arabia / modern day Palestine, where we're looking today, this god emerges out of like a nomadic tribal people. This god emerges, and because we have certain implications in Exodus and other places where it sounds like the father-in-law, where Moses discovers this God who's not named Yahweh before, is now being named Yahweh, but your fathers didn't know me as this, but now they know me, that maybe this tradition comes out of this area and the Midianite deity, that Yahweh might have been a Midianite deity. Fill me in, correct me. Am I on the right track?
Yes, I mean, you are. And it's a complicated issue because it's not like we've got extra textual evidence that can help us very much on this. They haven't found a huge cache of Kenite texts. And so this is largely based on an analysis of the Pentateuch, where it's recognized that within the Pentateuch you have different strands of tradition. The thing from the 19th century that many people still kind of basically hold to is the JEDP theory, the four document hypothesis. And the deal is that within these appear to be four different sources, sprung up different times, different places, were based on earlier oral traditions. And you have this account in Exodus, where Moses is given God's name as Yahweh, and he's told that no one has known him as Yahweh before, but now he's revealing it to him, which is a little bit confusing because when you read the book of Genesis, God reveals his name Yahweh to Abraham. Hundreds of years earlier, and Abraham calls him Yahweh, and so it's like, oh, wait a second. And so the theory is that one of these Pentateuchal sources had its roots in this region of Midian, because Moses' father-in-law, who's given two different names in the Old Testament, what is it, Jethro and Ruthiel or something, that the two names come from two different sources, and the Moses tradition come from two different sources, and that one of these sources is different from the source of Genesis, and that the one source that has this kind of Kenite, Midianite thing is a source that goes back from there. And so in order to say, though, that Yahweh arose as that divinity, you'd have to say that that's the source that's preserving a historical recollection more than the source that's recording that Abraham got this thing in Canaan. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's one of the theories that Yahweh arose there as opposed to somewhere else.
Thank you. Despite searches in the Sinai over many years, no credible archaeological artifacts have been found supporting the Old Testament Exodus story. Yet many believers argue the time interval from at least 1250 BCE to the present has destroyed such evidence. However, the 1996 discovery of a Bronze Age battlefield site next to the Tolenz River in northeast Germany dated to between 1300 and 1200 BC and involving far fewer people has already yielded over 13,000 artifacts. Since Northern Europe's climate is generally less hospitable to the preservation of artifacts than the Sinai, is this not an additional talking point to assert the biblical Exodus never occurred?
Could you remind which modern discovery were they referring to that's going to matter?
Bronze Age battlefield site next to Tolenz River in northeast Germany, dated to between 1300 and 1200. So it's about the same time distance.
Yeah. No, it's a good comparison. Yeah, no, this idea, you get this, and even critical scholars will sometimes say, "Look, how could you have any remains? It all got wiped out." Well, did chariots, get buried? What happened to them? They would still be around. And so it's not just the thing in Germany. It's throughout. Let me say several things. One thing is, in terms of remains, many people think that Egypt's the only place where anything's going to remain because of the dry climate. And as it turns out, for most kinds of materials, especially organic materials, it doesn't matter if it's a dry climate or not to survive thousands of years. What matters is that it has a consistent climate of humidity. It's the humidity level. And so, for example, there's this British army camp that was discovered in England where they found letters that these Roman soldiers wrote 2,000 years ago. It was in a bog. Wow. Yeah, because the humidity was constant. And so if the humidity goes up and down, then you forget it. But if it's constant, and so it isn't the amount of time, it isn't the dryness, it's like the consistency. And so, but things like metal will survive, of course, in sand for basically forever. And so there have been many discoveries of, you just think about Paleolithic art. Paleolithic, it still survives. So the point about the Exodus is absolutely right. There's no trace, including, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Numbers, basically most of the 40 years of Israel in the wilderness was at Kadesh Barnea, which is it's this place kind of south of Israel that was like an oasis, a big oasis. And boy, if they dug around in that place and found nothing. The people were there for decades, like eating off of plates, and like sharpening swords and things. There's nothing. So, yeah. And, when I was a fundamentalist, we always heard that there are chariots at the bottom of the Red Sea. Yeah, that's wrong. And so there's nothing in Egypt. There's nothing in the Sinai. There is nothing to suggest it.
And I hope everybody knows you can go in the description and you can actually sign up for your Exodus course that you've done. So you definitely need to check out Bart Ehrman's course on that because he dives into this lots of fun.
There are actually two courses. So I did one on Genesis, which deals with kind of the Pentateuch, but deals with but the other was on Exodus through Deuteronomy. And yeah, this wilderness stuff, the Exodus, I get into all the historical business on that.
Sign up today. What is your opinion regarding the authenticity of the James ossuary and the Talpiot tomb? Do you believe either or both provide evidence for the existence of Jesus and his family line?
No, I don't think so. I know that my friend James Tabor very much thinks so. And I assume that there are other scholars who do, although I don't think I know of any others. I know a number of archaeologists who don't give it any credence at all. Famous, Eric Myers, Jody Magnus. People. They think that these are not ancient artifacts.
Thank you. Do you think the early Jewish Christians of the Jerusalem church, rather than Paul, had a better understanding of Jesus, his message, and aims? Certainly during the early years, there must have been some in this movement who actually knew Jesus and heard him preach. Few, if any, followed Paul as far as we know.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. James was Jesus' brother. He was the head of the church. Peter was his right-hand man. John was a pillar of the church. Those people spent a long time with Jesus. And I think they probably did have a better understanding of the historical Jesus. Their conflict with Paul, though, doesn't appear to have been about their understanding of the historical Jesus or about their understanding of his death and resurrection. Their big differences with Paul had to do with the relationship of Jew and Gentile. And that was something Jesus probably never talked about.
Wow. So it might have overshadowed a lot of the other stuff. There was so much conflict.
Well, certainly did eventually. Christianity was about the death and resurrection of Jesus, but that conflict was really Paul thought it was the biggest. He thought it was the biggest thing that ever hit the planet. This conflict about whether he thought the Galatians were going to lose their salvation if they would get circumcised, and he blamed the Jerusalem apostles, but he didn't. That was his opinion. I'm not sure they thought it was that important. They just thought, yeah, that's not our view. They agreed on the death and resurrection of Jesus, though.
Why do you think early Jewish Christians objected to eating meat sacrificed to idols as mentioned, for example, in Galatians? Was it because they believed such a sacrifice would allow demons to enter the meat, infect those who ate it, as well as those non-eaters who were nearby, like a virus?
It's not Galatians. It's 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and 10, and also in the book of Revelation. We're not told what the objection is. There are hints about it. The hints about it suggest that some people think that this meat. So the way it works is this. There's kind of a long backstory. I won't give the whole thing, but the basic story is that in the ancient world, you couldn't go to the butcher and buy your meat, or the grocery store. The animals that are killed are being slaughtered, and they're being slaughtered as sacrifices in pagan ritual. And so the worship of God would often involve sacrificing an animal to the god, and the animal, then the fat and the bones would be burned, and the smell would be, that's what the gods liked, and then the humans would keep the meat, and they'd have a party and they'd eat the meat, but then there'd be meat left over, or the meat would be given to the temple, or the priest sold the meat. And so if you ate meat, usually it meant that it had been sacrificed to a pagan god. And so the question about that is, how does that fit in? And the one idea, so it looks like in 1 Corinthians, in the city of Corinth, there are people who are saying there are two groups. One group is saying, look, the pagan gods don't exist. They might think that they're sacrificing this thing to a god. There's no god. So they've got this statue of wood. They sacrifice it in front of us. So what? It's just meat. And so they say, of course we can eat the meat. And there are other people who are saying, look, this is sacrifice to a pagan deity. If you participate in this, you are participating in pagan sacrificial rituals. And so you're giving approbation to pagan practices. You can't do that. Other Christians said you can't do that because they said, yes, those are not gods. They're demons, and you're participating in demon worship. And so there are a variety of views about this within the Christian community. It's not clear that it was Jewish Christians against Gentile Christians. It might have been. It might have been that Jewish Christians were concerned that the food hadn't been sacrificed, since it hadn't been sacrificed in the correct way. It was not kosher. That might have been a thing. I don't know that there's any evidence that demons were entering into the meat and infecting people through that. It's an interesting idea, but I don't know that there's much to say for it. I don't, or maybe against it. We don't really know. But Paul does say in 1 Corinthians 10 that he's kind of debating the matter, and he basically ends up saying, yeah, I don't want you participating in the worship of demons, and so don't eat meat.
Thank you. Who were the Desposini? I'm trying here. And do you think they may have formed a dynasty in the early Jerusalem church?
How do you spell it?
Huh?
How do you spell the word?
Desposini. Desposini. It would beat returning to Galilee and resuming a subsistence lifestyle. What do you think happened to them during the Jewish War 66 to 70? So it's this idea of they formed a dynasty in the early Jerusalem church?
Disponini, if I know. I have no idea. I don't know what that word means, disposini. It sounds like a Greek word. DYS would mean bad. Posini, pasa. I don't know what the person's referring to.
Maybe one day we'll come back to it. What are the Codex Fuldensis and San Galensis 1395, and what importance do they have for scholars?
What? Am I in my PhD exams here? What?
I know. Do
Okay.
you have any recollection of these
You know,
particular
fuldensis,
codex?
I know fuldensis. I should know sangalensis because I think I used it in my dissertation 45 years ago. Fuldensis is an important Latin manuscript that is it's a gospel harmony that some people think is dependent on Tatian's diatessaron, uh, or that somehow it's related to the diatessaron, or more likely it's just another case where, a harmony is where you take the four gospels and you take the stories in each one and you combine them all so that you end up with one big gospel. That's what the diatessaron was, done by Tatian in the 2nd century. And it was, he was a Syriac Christian who studied with Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century in Rome. And he made this diatessaron. It's not clear if he did it, what language he did it in, if he did it in Greek or if he did it in Syriac. But it got translated in Syriac or written in it, and it became the standard version of the Gospels in Syria for centuries. So they didn't have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They had this thing. And Codex Fuldensis is kind of like that. It looks like it's a Latin version of a gospel harmony of some kind. So that's what that is. Sangalensis. I'm drawing a blank. Sorry.
No biggie, no biggie. He says, what is the Codex Claromontanus, and what is its importance to scholars studying the Western type text?
Okay. So Codex Claromontanus is what people call Codex D. It is a 5th century text. It's one of the most studied texts of Greek New Testament scholars because it's fairly early. It's one of our earliest texts. It's one of our most complete texts, and it's one of our most bizarre texts. It is a Greek-Latin book, so it's a diglot. It's got Greek on one side of the page and Latin on the other side of the page, and so it has the four Gospels and Acts, and so you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts in 2 columns, and it's a bizarre manuscript because it has a lot of textual readings. It has lots of ways of wording verses that is completely different from other manuscripts. And so the big question has been historically, is it just aberrant by an aberrant scribe, or is it standing in an ancient tradition that is aberrant, or is it standing in an ancient tradition that in fact shows that all these other manuscripts are aberrant? Wow. And so, and it has some really interesting textual variants in it. It has been much written about there are scholars who have written entire books on it, a number of really important books on it. That deal with various aspects of it, including, for example, a classic work by Eldon Epp that tried to show that in the book of Acts, at least, the manuscript has an anti-Jewish bias, for example.
Wow. Thank you for that. What is the Johannine comma, and when did it first appear in a manuscript?
Okay. So in grammatical terms, a comma is not just a punctuation mark. Our punctuation mark, our comma, the punctuation mark in English, separates off a kind of a sense unit that is shorter than a sentence, for example. Or it's shorter than something you'd use a semicolon for. Okay? So in Greek, when they talk about a comma or a colon, they're not talking about the punctuation mark, they're talking about the sense unit. Like, so if I have a phrase, for example, whatever phrase. So the Johannine comma is a unit of text in 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. It is the passage that is the only passage in any of our manuscripts of the New Testament that appears to affirm explicitly the doctrine of the Trinity. In 1 John chapter 5, The author of First John, whoever he was, says in the context of a discussion that there are three that bear witness: the Father, the Father, the water, and the blood. Okay, he's just talked about Jesus attests to the water and the blood, and maybe a reference to in the Gospel of John when his side is pierced, water and blood come out, and so he says the water and the blood bear witness, and so First John is saying there are three that bear witness: the Father, the water, and the blood, and that's what it says in almost all the Greek manuscripts. When Erasmus produced his first edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516. It was the first time anybody had printed a copy of the New Testament on a printing press, as opposed to somebody writing it out by hand. When you write it out by hand, it's a manuscript. When you do it on the printing press, then it's a printed text. Erasmus didn't have very many manuscripts to base his text on, and he printed 1 John chapter 5 without those, just with those words. There are three that bear witness: the Father, the water, and the blood. In the Latin tradition, in the Latin Bible, in the manuscripts, the thousands and thousands of Latin manuscripts, and in the Latin printed Bible, the Bible that had been used in the Western Church, the Roman Church, for centuries and centuries, had an additional line. There are three that bear witness. In heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness on earth: the Father, the blood, the water, and the blood. So this phrase, there are three that bear witness in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. That's the Johannine comma. And it was a controversial issue because Erasmus, in the first Greek version, didn't include it because it wasn't in his Greek manuscript. But many, many, many people objected on the grounds that Erasmus had eliminated the Trinity from the New Testament. And Erasmus pointed out it's not in the Greek manuscripts. But they finally found some manuscripts that incorporated, that they found that was actually from about the time that he was doing his editions. Somebody was copying out the Greek manuscript and included it in Greek. And he ended up including it in a later edition of his printed edition of his Greek New Testament, and that later printed edition of Erasmus's New Testament was ultimately the basis for the King James version of the New Testament. And so that phrase, the Johannine comma, will be found in the King James version and in conservative evangelical versions that will include it, even though textual scholars are unanimous. This baby did not belong there. This was added. And so, yeah.
One more, Bart, and then we'll hope people will go sign up for your new course and all the courses that you have. But your Paul and Jesus is the latest. Due to similarities between Matthew and Luke, scholars have posited the existence of a lost sayings collection called Q, that the authors of both Gospels had access to and copied from. However, some scholars have argued these similarities can be explained if it is assumed Luke had access to both Mark and Matthew. Which position do you hold and why?
So the first position is called the four-document hypothesis. And it holds that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have four written sources behind them. Mark was the first. Matthew and Luke both used Mark. And so that's why many times Mark's wording, his stories, the sequence of his stories, word for word the same in places in both Matthew and Luke. It's because they were both copying him and sometimes changing one thing or another thing. But they're getting their Mark and stories from Mark. But they have a number of sayings that are not found in Mark, like the Beatitudes or the Lord's Prayer, etc. The idea is that they got them from the source that no longer exists, a source that contained mainly sayings of Jesus that scholars have called Q. Q is short for the German word Quelle, because German scholars developed this view. The word Quelle in German just means source. This is the sayings source for Matthew and Luke. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you got Mark, you you got Q. You got Matthew has a bunch of stories himself. That's M. Luke has a bunch of stories himself. That's L. So you got Mark, Q, M, and L. That makes up the three synoptics. Okay, that's the theory. That has been the dominant theory since the middle of the 19th century. There have been alternative theories, including many before that and many after, and one that is catching hold now, especially because of my friend Mark Goodacre, with whom I completely disagree. Mark follows the Farrer hypothesis, which was taught by his. Farrer had a student who was Mark Goodacre's teacher, and so it kind of is that lineage. Mark holds this Farrer hypothesis. The Farrer hypothesis is that Mark was first. Matthew and Luke both used Mark, but that Luke used both Matthew and Mark. So that's why you have similarities. That's why Matthew and Luke have a number of things in common that aren't in Mark, because Matthew put them in his gospel and Luke copied them from Matthew. So that's the theory. The virtue of that theory is a very strong virtue that cannot be taken lightly. It's that it eliminates a hypothetical source.
Right.
And so Occam's razor would say, get rid of the hypothetical source. And it's absolutely right. If you can get rid of a hypothetical source without creating bigger problems, baby, go that way. Some of these solutions, this is called solutions to this problem. This is called the synoptic problem. How do you explain the relationships, the similarities and the differences among Matthew, Mark, and Luke? How do you do it? And some hypotheses are just crazily complicated. That you've got this source, this hypothetical source is copied, that hypothetical is copied, that source, and then it came down to this, and you have these diagrams like, oh my God! And so you want to get rid of as many hypothetical sources as you can. The problem is that if you get rid of Q, you create huge problems that cannot, in my opinion, be solved very readily. It's a probability case, and so you have to judge which is more probable. But my view is that there are really good reasons for thinking that Luke did not use Matthew. If you want some kind of obvious ones to begin with, they both have birth narratives and genealogies. Look at their birth narratives and genealogies. Does it look to you like Luke got them from Matthew? They're all different. I mean, they have Jesus born of a virgin in Bethlehem, okay, and he's got a genealogy. That's nice. Look at them. They didn't even get them from Matthew. You got them from somewhere else, okay? So there's a lot of places where you have overlap where it's clear Luke's not getting it from Matthew, but there are bigger problems. One very big problem is that Matthew and Luke often have the same sequence of their stories. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Matthew and Luke have that same sequence. That's always in stories found in Mark. Almost always. Not completely, but almost always those are the stories you got in Mark. That would make sense. They're both copying Mark, and they have different places for they're following his outline. Okay, so that makes sense. The problem is when you have these sayings materials that are not in Mark, the sequences are different. So the Lord's Prayer comes at a different place in Matthew than in Luke. The Beatitudes come in a different place from Luke. This parable here occurs here in Matthew, but there in Luke. And so to imagine that happening, it doesn't always happen, but that's the regular pattern, except in places where you can explain it. The sayings of Jesus in Matthew and Luke about in the temptation, man shall not live by bread alone. Those are in the same places in Matthew and Luke, even though that saying's not in Mark. But they're in the same place because Mark has the temptation narrative. He has a shorter version of it, and they're including the sayings in the temptation version. That's the sayings during his temptation. So you can explain a lot of these similarities. But if Luke copied Matthew, why did he take just the things that are not in Mark to rearrange their sequence? Why did he do that? And how did he do it? So I think what we often imagine is that somebody has a big desk in front of him, and he's got 3 books in front of him, And these are like books, like, with written on both sides of the page. You open up like our books. And what Luke's doing is he's copying Mark from his book. He cuts and then he's copying Matthew. He says, "Oh yeah." So if he's doing that way, then he's reading Mark and he's reading Matthew at the same time. And they both have that story. Okay, I'm going to put that in the same place. Okay, same story. I'll put that one in the same. Then he comes across something Matthew. Oh, that's not Mark. Oh, I'm going to put that somewhere else. Why? I mean, why does the Sermon on the Mount all of a sudden become like all over the place in Luke? I mean, why? But not only why, but how. Ancient scribes appear not to have desks. They wrote on their knees. How do you do that when you're copying two books at once? I really don't know. I mean,
is it fair to say that the whole problem is way messier than any of these hypotheses are trying to maybe propose?
My mentor in graduate school was Bruce Metzger, very famous textual critic. And he always talked about the least problematic solution. Which solution causes the fewest problems? And that's what happens in this case. Does Q cause fewer problems than Luke copying Matthew? And I think the answer is a strong yes. It causes fewer problems. Mark Goodacre thinks the opposite. So I'll say that Mark Goodacre's views are starting to spread because he's had graduate students and he's convinced them, and so that's how it kind of works. But the majority of scholars still hold to Q. Most of them think it doesn't solve all the problems. But I'll tell you one issue that Mark Goodacre knows everything about this. He spent half of his life studying this issue, so he knows everything. But there are complications that many people would not think about. And I'll just name one for you, which is this: when we say that Matthew and Luke copied Mark, they didn't copy the same copy of Mark. They would have had different copies. And if they had different copies, the copies would have had different wording in places. Okay? So, not only that, they didn't have our copy of Mark. When we do these comparisons of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we're doing it out of a Greek New Testament that Greek scholars have composed based on a number of manuscripts of Matthew, a number of manuscripts of Mark, and they said, well, this is probably what Mark originally wrote, this is probably what Matthew originally wrote, this is what Luke probably originally wrote, and then you compare them to see where they're similar and different to solve the synoptic problem. But Matthew and Luke did not have our printed Greek New Testament version of Mark. They had different versions of Mark. They're different from each other and different from ours. So how can you even make that comparison? And so one of Mark Goodacre's common arguments is Matthew and Luke have this small agreement. They're called minor agreements. Mark has something else, and Matthew and Luke they agree again. That shows that Luke used Matthew. It might show that. It might show that they both had a copy of Mark that's different from our Mark. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are so many problems like that. That's why you go with the least problematic answer.
Who do you think is the most formidable opponent against Mark Goodacre's position defending Q? I was thinking of Kloppenborg, but I'm curious because I'd love to maybe make a debate happen. Would you be interested? I don't know. I'm just throwing things out there.
There are some things in New Testament studies that I really enjoy teaching at a very basic level that I really do not enjoy going into the weeds on. For example, the chronology of Paul's life. It's like there are people who are just like, this is like they spend their lives. Oh, God, where was he in August of the year 53? That kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, oh, my God, no. And the synoptic problem is one of them. It's like, or the source of the PseudoClementines. It's like, I've got these things. I just do not want to get into to debate Mark. So who's the most formidable opponent? I don't know. I think most people just don't agree with him and don't even bother refuting him because they just think it's problematic. But Kloppenborg knows a lot about Q. I don't agree with a lot of his. Kloppenborg has a theory I don't agree with on Q. Kloppenborg is one of these people who thinks that you can show the various versions of Q. So you've got Q1, Q2, Q3, where you have these various, like this was the first edition of Q. This is the second edition. This is the third edition, which is very helpful for the Jesus seminar because his first edition of Q doesn't have any apocalyptic material in it. And so that's convenient because that means that the earliest source about Jesus is not apocalyptic. Yeah, well, right. If you can divide out 3 levels of editing of a non-existent source, that's kind of problematic for a lot of us. But Kloppenborg, yeah, he would be a very good one if he's willing to do it. I just don't know. I don't know people who even bother to argue for Q because most people just subscribe to it.
Bart, I enjoyed every minute of this. You are always such a great teacher, and we at MythVision honor everything, and we really appreciate your time. I hope people will go get the Paul and Jesus course because you put a lot of time and energy into this. You've actually got a long list of courses that you've done on your website. They can go down in the description. I've got all of those links there. You just click the link. You're helping us here at MythVision. You're also helping Bart to continue doing courses, educating the world. Is there anything you'd like to end on and letting people know about that course?
Well, I'll just say that I think it's, of course, everybody who writes a book thinks that it's the most important topic anybody's ever thought of. And everybody does a course thinks it's the most important course everybody's ever done in the universe and all that. So I get that. But I've got to say, if you're interested in early Christianity, the relationship of Paul and Jesus, I mean, if you don't work that one out, forget being interested in early Christianity because you're not. Because this is like one of the really big things. It is. It's huge. I think it's huge historically and religiously. For people who are Christian, it's important to figure out how these two might relate to each other without, covering over the differences. And for people who aren't Christian, it's just like historically, wow, how did Christianity become this thing? And so I think it's a really important topic. And I love doing this course and writing this course. And I think people would benefit from it.
Thank you so much, Bart. Everybody, check it out.